Everyone loves shopping online. Well, I'm going to tell you what I tell my golf buddies when they buy clubs. Stop searching for coupon codes. Download Capital One Shopping to your computer. Capital One Shopping instantly searches for available coupon codes and automatically applies them at checkout. Plus, it's free, and you don't even need a Capital One card to use it. That's like hitting a hole in one without even trying. Capital One Shopping. It's kind of genius. What's in your wallet?
Savings and available coupons vary.
You've dreamed of building a family, but the journey hasn't been easy. I'm Dr. Laura Shaheen, a reproductive endocrinologist helping people build families every day. On our new podcast, Baby or Bust, we'll be learning from both reproductive experts and people who have faced challenges just like yours. Join us every week for Baby or Bust, wherever you listen to your podcasts. Make sure to follow us so you never miss an episode.
Quick disclaimer, this week's episode is in 2 parts. This is part 2. And I can see why your husband would say to you, like, surely you've heard 1 or 2 of them at Christmas time, even if you didn't celebrate
Jingle
them.
bells, let's say,
But of course, through what you've just told us there about being pulled out of anything that looked like it was remotely related to Christmas celebrations, and even to the point where you were sinning outright by lying to people about gifts you got for Christmas and then having the forethought to keep back certain gifts that you'd been given so you could showcase them to your peers after Christmas. It's almost like, we've talked about this on the show before as well. It's almost like you're having to learn how to manipulate people around you to make life easier for you to navigate, which in itself is like, it's like you learning how to almost replicate what the high demand religious group is doing to you so that you can do it to other people so that you can have an easier time. So you're learning how to. Yeah,
it's not a good thing. I mean, you call it manipulation and you're right. And it certainly has a negative connotation to it. But that is what it was. I did not want to be found out. I didn't want to go to school and have to explain this extremely convoluted religion when everyone else, just said, oh, I'm Catholic. Oh, okay. Now we know why you're getting pulled out to, go to catechism. Great. Oh, you're Jehovah's Witnesses. Oh, okay. Well, we kind of understand that. Nobody knew, as large as this organization was, and still pales in comparison to many, Christian sects. Nobody knew the worldwide Church of God, and everything that came with it. And, in many ways, I was ashamed of that and ashamed that it was so different from everybody else. How do you even begin to explain this? And so now I'm, I don't hold that level of shame. Now it's just more, inconvenient. So if I go somewhere, where there's, a Christmas celebration, for instance, like we were going to, I don't want to get into this. This is, how long have we been on now? And we're not even, we haven't even covered all of it. How do I explain to someone why I don't know Christmas carols?
And it's I was just looking here at the amount of stuff that I've got left to ask, and it's my fault because I just go off on tangents and throw my thoughts out there and talk about all.
It's all good
things. So, but I want to make sure that we capture more of your story and less of me droning on about things that I think are right when they might not even be right. But I always do challenge my listeners to get in touch with me if I say anything incorrect. So feel free to reach out and tell me, and also feel free to tell me that I speak too much and to let my guests talk more. So we've talked about what school looked like for you. and what education looked like for you. I recognize that the last week of Christmas, when you're younger in school, the last week of leading up to Christmas, the teachers kind of just can't be bothered. So every lesson is, today we're going to make snowflakes, where you and I just said there, where you make snowflakes, but then you might not know where you just fold over a piece of paper loads of times and then just cut triangles out of the edges of the piece of paper, and then you unfold it and it makes like a really hideous paper Christmas decoration. So there's an example of somebody that would go, what do you mean you don't know how to make snowflakes? So
yeah, I actually don't know how to make snowflakes. When we were, I remember being in like, I forget if it was elementary school and or middle school, and we went to art class, and, as you say, during the holidays, it was Halloween, Thanksgiving, Christmas, the art that you were supposed to make that week was, holiday related. I don't know how to do any of that. I was either pulled away from art class, or the teachers were specifically told that they were to give me something else to do, something else to make. So someone next to me is doing, drawing Santa Claus. I'm drawing, a house or the sunset, something like that. And the cult also, their idea was that all of these things, all of these symbols were pagan, the Christmas tree, the Santa Claus, but they went, even further. They thought that, the cross, that Christians, put up in their churches or, wear around their neck, that was pagan. And so there was not to be, any symbols in our congregation. There was, no pictures of Jesus, no crosses, nothing like that.
As you get older in school, you mentioned there that there were other things going on. So there was less kind of holiday-based activities, which I think, again, is recognizable in the way that when you're younger, teachers kind of just for the last week give up and just throw anything crafty, fun, film related that they can. But then as you get older, you've got exams and other things kind of take over, and you can't spend your life, unfortunately, doing arts and crafts. As you're reaching graduation of high school. So at that age, a lot of people's attention start to turn towards romantic relationships as well. So did you have to navigate that part of high school in terms of seeing your peer group pair off together, or gossip amongst each other about feelings or attractions, or exploring kind of hormones and all of that development that happens around sexuality?
Oh, sexuality is an interesting topic, and I'm not sure how much I am going to divulge, but I will say that, as a child, as a teenager, our relationships, whether they be with the opposite sex in school or relationships even with non-cult family members, they were all controlled by cult expectations. We were not really allowed to socialize with people who were outside of the cult. And that meant, even friends. So, I had friends, but those friendships kind of remained within the walls of school. And so any sort of, real dating also did not occur. I know that, some of my friends whose parents were considered probably a little bit more liberal allowed their, children to, date here or there. But many, including mine, kept a very tight rein on that. And we were not, we were not allowed, to date anyone in school. Dating was basically told, we were told that dating was supposed to lead to marriage. And so if you weren't ready to get married, you weren't ready to date. So a 14-year-old's not ready to get married, a 14-year-old's not dating. A 17-year-old is not ready to get married, a 17-year-old is not dating. Dating was really something that would occur within the confines, of the cult. And if it was, going to be, unchaperoned and not like, a bunch of friends getting together, it really had to occur 18 years plus. And it was strongly encouraged that only people who were baptized members of the cult were to date, and that it was specifically to see whether or not you were a good match to get married. And if you thought you were, you had to go to the minister and then do like marriage counseling and see if they, thumbs up or thumbs down. And not everyone got the thumbs up. Just trying to remember some, other things regarding dating here. So I didn't really officially, date anyone until after I left, the cult. There were, a couple of relationships and, in the cult, and they were not, those relationships were not looked at favorably. And it was, my parents, and by the way, I'm over 18 at this point, right? I left when I was 20. So between the ages of 18 and 20, there was a huge concern that I was engaging in inappropriate, sexual behavior, which, I kind of sometimes was.
Yeah, and I'm kind of rooting for you as well. Like, I want you to have a little bit of rebellion, especially, where you are.
I'm going to tell you something else. My husband, and you can edit this part out if you feel that this is not, appropriate. He didn't think it was appropriate. So he told me, don't say that. Be serious when you're on this podcast. So I want to tell you something that I feel, I'm definitely including in my memoir. And I feel definitely, shaped me as a sexual, human being in many ways. And that was when I think it was around the age of 14, I started listening to Dr. Ruth on Friday nights at 11 o'clock. And I had that radio because, this is the 80s. We didn't have Pandora. We didn't have, we had headsets, but we didn't have like the earplugs and all sorts of, the iTunes and everything else, that we have today. And so I had this radio because we didn't even have money for me to have a headset just yet. And so I had this little radio and I was in bed and I would listen as lowly as I can to Dr. Ruth, because Dr. Ruth, that was the only sexual education that I received. I never received any sexual education whatsoever. I cannot imagine my life without Dr. Ruth.
There's so many reasons why. First of all, it's great that you did mention this. It's nice to not always be too serious on the show. But also, how many other people out there are going to be in that same position, that grew up without sex education, and more importantly, without sex and relationship education? How many people end up in problematic relationships because they don't realize warning signs, red flags? How many people don't understand how pregnancy works? How many people don't understand how pleasure works? How many people think that, sexual intercourse is pounding away at somebody until you reach climax? Every body is different, and where anatomy may be mostly always the same, not everybody reacts to certain stimulus in the same way as the next person. So not only is
all of this
sex education and sex and relationship education is so important, and also understanding your own body and how your own body works and your own anatomy and what you should look and feel like. How many women might not know how to check for lumps because they've never been told to to touch themselves. I remember when when I gave birth to our son, and the breastfeeding consultants on the ward in the hospital were coming around saying, how are you getting on with latching him for breastfeeding? And I'd say, I'm really struggling. They would say, why don't you try stimulating your nipples to kind of, produce some colostrum, which is like really sticky, sweet, rich, clear-ish liquid that comes before the breast milk whilst your body is making the milk to bring that out for breastfeeding. And I was like, how do you even start to, what do they mean by, because I was never encouraged to explore my body, to understand how my body works. I've never been encouraged to stimulate my breasts in such a way. So I was kind of like, how do I do this? And they were like, why don't you hand express, place one hand here and one hand here and squeeze until you can release some breast milk. And I was thinking, I feel so embarrassed and uncomfortable. And obviously I've just had a baby and there's a woman standing over me, kind of she's touching my breasts and showing me how to do it. And I was like, this is horrible. And I grew up in a liberal household. I was never told which way or the other how to practice my religious beliefs or what I should and shouldn't believe in. I grew up in a household that was pretty much whatever you believe in, it's good, that's good for you, as long as it's safe and consensual and age appropriate and all of those things that come with pretty much liberal parenting. But even for me, that was uncomfortable. So I struggled to think about how it must be for somebody who tuned in to Dr. Ruth to learn about all of those things. Yeah. And for people that didn't have access to things like Dr. Ruth, but still would never received any form of sex and relationship education. Like, where do you even start with having comfortable sexual relations outside of a cult-like group, but also how difficult and strained or boring or uncomfortable some of the relationships inside of these groups must be, because people aren't encouraged to explore themselves freely in the way that they may be outside of a high demand religious group.
Yeah, the perception I always got from the cult, because they did not talk about that overtly, and the perception that I got from my own mother was that any sort of pleasure that someone receives, that a woman receives, is really should really come from a woman's husband. That's that's it. And so I didn't know anything. I mean, I have to tell you that I didn't even know how menstruation worked. So the first time that I menstruated, I thought that it was only going to happen once, because I remembered my mom telling me, well, you menstruate once a month. So I took that very literally. I'm like, okay, well, this is the one time. And I guess, so how do you predict? I guess somehow she's able to predict when that's going to happen next month. And then at that point, right? So I think I was 12. At that point, I find out that it's continuous for a week. And I was horrified. I was so disappointed about, growing up. And then when it came to sex, absolutely nothing. And so Dr. Ruth was, the only source where I really did receive just positive education, positive view of my body. And I cannot imagine what I would be like and what kind of sexual hangups I would have had I not had that sexual education from the age of 13. Dr. Ruth is the one who taught me how to masturbate, how to please myself, how when you are with a sexual partner, that, you're really not supposed to be selfish. You're supposed to want the other person to have a good time and to feel pleasure.
But also, around
birth
saying
control.
no, and when
And-
you're not comfortable with things, and when you don't want to have sex.
Right. I'll only do those things which, you are comfortable with. And that there's, as long as it's consensual adults, that everything is okay. There's no wrong way to have an orgasm. If a woman can't have, an orgasm one way, but she has another way, that's great. Let's celebrate that. The shame around sex was really not there for me. What I was concerned with as a teenager, growing up in the cult, with years of Dr. Ruth training, I tell you, I listened to her weekly. The conflict that I had in the cult was that the cult was saying I could only do these things, within marriage. And I wasn't so sure about that. But the one thing I knew for sure was that I didn't have access to birth control easily, and I most certainly did not want to have unwanted pregnancies. I actually do know people that I grew up with that had unwanted pregnancies in the cult. And I did not want that for myself, because I knew that if that happened to me, I would have never gotten the education that I have now. I would have never been, where I am today. Not that it's impossible for people, who do end up having, children at an early age, but I certainly knew that it would be much more difficult. And that was not a road I wanted to take. And so that alone was my motivator to, remain chaste, if you will, until such time, that I felt was appropriate and I could have access to birth control.
Something I saw on the r/ex-Christian subreddit the other day, which I found really interesting to read, was a question around purity culture and fetishes that have come from purity culture. So somebody posted saying, what fetishes do you have because of purity culture? And people would say things like, I just want to have sex with a woman dressed as a nun. And I really have a thing for like long skirts and dresses. And there were some really interesting things around there that made me think like it really doesn't matter what people do, if they are feeling aroused, anything's going to arouse them. So after reading that thread, I was like, oh, okay. So the covering of the clavicle it's not really deterring. It's not really deterring much. So we've got a few more things to go over, and I know that you've got some concise responses. So hopefully, if I stop rambling on, we might actually get through some of them. And quickly before we move on to how mental health was seen within the church, I wondered if you could give us some insight into the LGBTQIA plus community, if this is a faith-based group that is very much a man and a woman and no premarital sex and only sex within a marriage in the marital bed.
My question, in response to yours would be, what LGBTQ plus community? Absolutely not. None of that would have been allowed. From what I understand from, little conversations that, my parents have had with me, and just things that I've, heard growing up in the cult, was that, they understood that there were some people who, had these feelings in them that were impure. That's how they would, consider LGBTQ plus. So they had these, impure feelings, and as long as they didn't act on them, everything, would be okay in the sense that they were allowed to attend the cult and they wouldn't be, disfellowshipped. And you don't want to be disfellowshipped, certainly you can be disfellowshipped for any reason. I'll just kind of throw that in, but you don't want to be disfellowshipped because if you're disfellowshipped from God's one true church, you're going to lose salvation and you might be in the wrong resurrection. And if you're not in the right resurrection, then you're not going to become this demigod, and it's very convoluted. But they recognize, back to the LGBTQ plus community that did not exist, is that they recognize that some people, had that struggle, is what they called it. It was a struggle, and it was something that they would have to, struggle with during their life. But as long as they didn't act on it, they didn't technically sin. And then that was okay.
Okay for the church, but, probably not so much for the individual. Not so much for the individual as
we'll learn with, at least, one person and others that I've heard of.
And that kind of leads us into the segment around mental health within the church and how that was tackled as an issue, whether it was taken seriously, whether there was any teachings around it. I know that you had some responses around that line of questioning.
Yeah. The subject matter generally of, psychology, mental health, mental health therapy, these were all, denigrated by the cult. This was not something that they encouraged, and they actually spoke actively over the pulpit against. I remember, just specific statements like, we shouldn't be building self-esteem. We should be building esteem in God esteem. So, again, that focus not on ourselves and in improving ourselves or, just, esteeming ourselves in any way, but always, the focus, was on God. So, the mental health of cult members and, just the psychology of cults in general, as we talk about the subject is so interesting to me. People join cults as we said, for a variety of reasons. But some join at a point in their lives when they have, untreated mental health issues. And I've certainly seen that with several of the people that I know of in this particular cult. Not everyone, right? But some certainly did have untreated mental health issues, or they experienced, certain psychological vulnerabilities at the very point in time when the cult came along and they became members. So once inside, a cult, it's likely that certainly a cult like this one, it's likely that, certain mental health issues are going to remain unresolved. And if they remain unresolved, they also could potentially get worse. One thing that I wanted to mention was that I really do think that there needs to be more academic research on, the mental health of second generation cult members and survivors, and how it may be similar and how it may be different than the mental health of first generation cult members and survivors, and what's the prevalence of, developing mental health issues just as a result of joining a cult that perhaps didn't exist pre-cult, for those who are, first generation.
I think you're exactly right there in mentioning that people, when they are extremely vulnerable and may find themselves in those vulnerable positions, may be approached by people who can bring them in to a high demand religious group when they are experiencing periods of ill mental health. If you are somebody born into a group and you're predispositioned ill mental health in your family, if it's hereditary, if you have dormant, a lot of people have bipolarity, which remains dormant for ages. People have, 18 to 21 is usually around the age where things like schizophrenia may present in a person. So
Right.
where is the support for second, third gen members who reach that age and have these things start to kind of unravel, and they present in this way, and it's being presented over the pulpit by I don't know if it's preachers, pastors?
Yeah, they were called ministers and pastors. So there was hierarchy, but basically the other ministry was like, pastors, and then there were deacons, and then there were elders, and
usually always men.
Always men, of course. Okay. Yeah, no women were allowed, to basically tell any man what to do. That included, marriage. But that also included especially in matters of, spirituality. They were not allowed to lead at all.
Which is always very interesting when you go back to looking at Seventh-day Adventism, which was founded by Ellen G. White, who is a woman, and yet right. The SDA Church itself and the branches that have come from the SDA Church are very much against women holding any kind of positions of power. And again, that misogyny that we see in a lot of these Christian-based groups comes through and exists, which is unfortunate. And everyone will know by now that that's my stance on the matter. So it is problematic there to have no support around mental health, but also to actively have a stance that is against almost ill mental health. If you do begin to suffer depression period or an anxiety period, or some type of psychosis or ill mental health, and you're unable to cope with those things or understand those things, or learn to adapt, or learn your triggers, or be in a safe and comfortable environment where you have the space to try to understand and teach yourself. I really, really, really don't like going into crowded shops. So if like friends want to go clothes shopping and they go into a really busy shop, I'm just going to wait outside. If I go into a pub or a bar and it's really, really busy, like I'm just going to go drink somewhere else. Like it's that for me, it's just, and I understand that. But if you're not in a place or an environment where you can learn that that's something that's making you uncomfortable, and right. The steps you can take to avoid those situations for yourself, it must be extremely difficult for, as you said, second and third generation members who aren't given that space and aren't given that understanding and don't even really recognize what's happening or who can they speak to without right. kind of being dismissed. And told that, we need to focus harder on the scripture, or with things like Pentecostalism, that person has schizophrenia, they must be have a demon in their body. So let's kind of try to banish the demons and perform exorcisms and really awful, horrible stories that we've heard.
Yeah. And the cult is, is similar to that. Also, mental health, from what I understand, was treated similarly to their stance on conventional medicine. So, there were some people that I knew of who, did go to a psychologist and may have been, given medications, but it just didn't seem like the norm, unless, the other thing that occurs, even outside of cults and just in our society in general, there's, this stigma of going to a mental health professional. So perhaps more were going, than I'm aware of, but there certainly was quite a backlash, over the pulpit against, psychologists, psychology in general, and any sort of, mental health therapy. It was viewed as, something of the devil, because it did not include the element of God. It did not include the element of prayer and study and following God's laws. And I think that in many ways, they were concerned that, if all of us ran to therapists, we would quickly figure out that what was happening in the cult was, undue influence, and we'd hightail it out of there. So they demonized.
It comes back to that, the many versus the few again, and needing to control the many, because if the many turn on the few, then there'll be a very quick overturn of the way things work. Right. So it makes sense that seeking professional help would be extremely deterred. So in light of discussing mental health and the kind of the spectrum and education and how there's been a lot of progression in the Western world around the way mental health is tackled, the way that it is talked about, and the lack of discussion thereof in the church that you grew up in. Do you believe that this led to anybody kind of putting them being at risk to themselves or others? And were there situations where people, acted on their suicidal ideation or self-harming or any of those things that potentially could have been avoided if it was a subject that was talked about, educated about, and maybe just a bit more accepted?
Yeah, absolutely. In the local congregation that I attended as a teenager, and I did attend, a few, four or five. When I was at this particular congregation as a teenager, there was a pastor, an assistant pastor, that had just recently been rotated in specifically to fix this particular congregation for whatever reason. As a kid, I wasn't quite sure what was going on, but around that time, it was the 80s, and I remember Armstrong mentioning several times, in his broadcast that we needed to get the church back on track, whatever that meant. At the time I just thought, hey, people just aren't following the rules very, very strictly. And maybe that's what we need to do. I don't know. But he was going to fix us, this pastor that got rotated into this particular congregation. And he was, I guess, going to get us back on track. What ended up happening was that there was a rash of suicides, really, that began very soon after this pastor was reassigned to our local congregation, a total of 7, actually, over a period of 20 years. So just kind of to break that down, from what I understand, the number of suicides in this particular congregation that I was in during this particular pastor's tenure far exceeds that of other congregations in the cult, as far as I understand. I was told by people, that I knew, that in some of the cases, the pastor spoke with the suicide victims shortly before they died. Oh. But I don't know that firsthand. But this is what I had heard. So, the people that I know about in this particular congregation to use guns on themselves, one intentionally overdosed on medication. He was a friend of mine. He died 30 years ago this month. 2 jumped off bridges. One of their bodies was never found. 1 stabbed themselves in the heart in their parents' kitchen. And there's another one, and of course, I'm specifically not using names, but there was another one that I recently learned about, but whose specific circumstances I'm just unaware of. So, these are 7 people that I knew, or I knew of them, because they were in our congregation. They were 2nd generation members, all of them, like me, close, to my age, give or take a few years. And some died by suicide while they were still in the cult, and others died after leaving the cult as they just tried to adjust to the real world. I personally also know of others who did, have suicidal ideations, but thankfully they did not go through with it.
The only commonality amongst all of those things is this one person.
You got it. You certainly have it. Yep.
Have there been, is there been any speculation within the congregation around what happened? Is he encouraging people to act on suicidal ideation? Is he the cause for the ill mental health?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much we don't know. And I wish I knew. I wish I knew of the conversations that these, that this particular pastor was having with these people prior, to them committing suicide. My friend, who died by suicide, he was gay. I later found out. So certainly I feel like that played a part. Not, him being gay played a part, but him being gay in this cult with this pastor, and who knows what this pastor told him. From what I understand, this particular pastor was much stricter than, some of the other pastors. My family, started going to this particular congregation because we moved from another state. And so we were actually attending a different congregation. And we started going to this particular congregation right around the same time that this pastor, was reassigned there. So I don't really know, how the previous pastor was, but apparently everybody loved him. And then I recently found out when talking to one of my friends, that I stay in contact with, she told me that it wasn't long after the previous pastor was reassigned to another church, another congregation, the nice one, the one that everyone liked, that he ended up leaving that cult altogether. What's really interesting, well, not interesting, but I would say, terrible, is that the pastor that was in charge of this congregation while I was there, under, whose watch these suicides occurred, he went on after, Worldwide dissipated, he went on to be a pastor in one of the offshoots. And, who knows how much more destruction he caused. I don't know, but he lived. He's still living, and he's a nice ripe old age and getting pensions, I'm sure, from various, if not one, perhaps two, different religious organizations.
That just baffled me.
Yeah,
it's so heartbreaking and tragic and confusing and hard to think about, because the death of your friend is obviously, it deeply affects you even today, and it was 30 years ago, and it's still kind of, we talked about celebrating birthdays and celebrating, people's existence on this planet, and of course, even when somebody's not with us anymore, we still think about them, and we still want to celebrate their existence and the marks that they leave on us, and the way that, every small interaction that you have with a person shapes who you are, and the way that you think and feel, and the actions that you take. And it's hard to think about the life that you have now and the things that you've experienced, that you've been able to experience since you've left, that those people may have also had the opportunity to experience had they been in the position that you are in now, and left or changed their course, or maybe just not have a single conversation with this strange guy, with this strange person,
Mm-hmm.
So,
And that's why I consider myself a cult survivor and not just a former cult member. And why I consider, all former cult members, cult survivors, because I don't think that everyone realizes that not everybody makes it. Not everybody gets to the other side alive. Not everyone gets to the other side intact. Not everyone gets to the other side without, suffering some very serious mental illness. And not everyone gets to leave cults altogether. So many people just go around cult hopping. They just go from one cult to another, and they never leave. So we're not all cult survivors, those who don't make it, those who stay in cults, but everyone else, we're cult survivors.
I'm just in the process of trying to put together some kind of core messages of these interviews that I've had. So this is like maybe the 200 or something interview, and people keep saying, there should be something that exists that is kind of like a compilation of everybody's thoughts, feelings, experiences, or core takeaway messages, and all of that stuff. And I was struggling because I didn't even know how to address the guests. If I was going to use like a title for the guests, I didn't even know if cult survivor would be the right term to use. And somebody said to me, well, you pick a term and you explain in the start of your writing why you've chosen that term. I'm going to address this community as cult survivors because XYZ. And what you've just said there is actually what I am going to take and quote it as the reason why you are all survivors. And I think that's really profound what you've just said there. Not everybody makes it is such a simple but really impactful way of saying there are so many people that have been lost to these control methods, this exploitation, this manipulation, this coercion, and I think that's I haven't heard it said in such a way that could be given to somebody that's had kind of no experience with cults, who has not come across, anybody that's been in a cult, or so they think,
or so they think.
Because again, their only reference to cults is what they've watched in a like Wild Country on Netflix,
right?
So I think that's a really great way of being able to make that easily digestible and accessible for people that haven't had these experiences or understand what it's like to have been in one of these groups. Somebody like me who hasn't experienced this firsthand, that's why we call ourselves survivors, because not everybody makes it. And yeah, that's great. So I just, that's really fantastic. So that we had a few more things that we needed to cover before we ended today.
Sure.
I think that this kind of leads us in nicely to talking about the acceptance of congregants overall. Was there, we mentioned kind of segregation and desegregation briefly when we spoke about Jim Jones, but did you feel like with the kind of undertones of racism in some of the beliefs and practices of the Worldwide Church of God, that there was perhaps racist undertones in the congregation as well, in the church itself? Did you feel like people that were not white were treated differently?
That's an interesting question, because overall, the culture of the cult was that people of color could basically be grafted in, very much like Ruth was in the Jewish Bible, to be, part of God's people. So people of color could be grafted in much like an adopted child is now part, of a new family. But that British Israelism, was always there. That was the underlying, foundation of this cult. So the way it presented itself was that, even if a person of color was to be part of the cult and they were quote unquote grafted in as if they were adopted, racial purity was still to be maintained. So no interracial, marriage at all. And there was a time in the cult's history, prior to me being a part of it, that the cult conformed to society's segregation laws here in the United States, and Blacks and whites were segregated in the congregation when they were, seated for church services. When it came to interactions, between members, it was fine to have, friends in the cult that were of another race, but there were no interracial marriages, as I've mentioned. And because there were no interracial marriages and dating was only done for the sole purpose of marriage, there was no interracial dating. And also people of the opposite, sex, they weren't even to be alone as if they're dating, especially if they were, interracial, if one was Black and one was white, because God forbid something happened, there's an attraction. And, next thing we know, we've got, biracial babies. There was some kind of, discussion on the ministerial level or perhaps even in headquarters, for all I know, about specifically the biracial children in the cult. So there were people who, first generation members who joined the cult and already had children. They already had, biracial children. And so the cult was trying to figure out what are they going to do with these biracial teens, right? Because how do you maintain, racial purity if you're half one thing and half another? So that, that was interesting. So as they matured, and, they were getting to be older teenagers, and it was expected that they were going to remain in the cult and become a baptized member, right? There were these discussions. And so there was a particular Bible study at our youth group. So we had to go to, church services on Saturday. There was, all Saturday was taken up, with this cult. And then in the evenings, Saturday evenings, the youth would get together, and then we would have another sort of Bible study that was directed, at our age group. Well, there was one Bible study that, one of my friends recently reminded me of. I don't recall it. I may not have been there that particular day, but I do remember hearing about it. And the ministers were sharing, with the teens during this Bible study that, any teen that was biracial, and by the way, there were only two in our local congregation, and they were both in this Bible study, that because they were biracial, they did indeed get the stamp of approval by the cult that they could choose, which race to date, whether it was Black or white. And, that was seen, I'm sure by some, that was seen as, liberal mindedness. And of course, by our standards today, that is completely, unacceptable. Well, I know and was friends with these two people. And, I remained friends with one of them. And I know that for that one, it was highly uncomfortable. It was so uncomfortable to be in that Bible study, listening to that she asked her mom, if she could just not go to the cult anymore. And by some stroke of miracle, and I think, that in and of itself is, complicated, but by some stroke of miracle, her mother said, sure, yeah, you don't have to go anymore. The other remained, and she ended up marrying, not too long after that, she ended up marrying another member of that cult that, that I was also friends with. But, even something as innocuous as dancing was not allowed between different races. And I have a couple of short stories about that, just to show the extent of how strictly this interracial thing was enforced.
You've dreamed of building a family, but the journey hasn't been easy. I'm Dr. Laura Shaheen, a reproductive endocrinologist helping people build families every day. On our new podcast, Baby or Bust, we'll be learning from both reproductive experts and people who have faced challenges just like yours. Join us every week for Baby or Bust, wherever you listen to your podcasts. Make sure to follow us so you never miss an episode.
We travel to see what's around the bend and what we're capable of. And now Capital One's new class of travel card can keep up with you. Introducing Venture X from Capital One. With 10x miles on hotels and rental cars, and 5x miles on flights booked through Capital One Travel, and 2x miles on everything else you buy. Venture X, for those always asking, where next? Capital One, what's in your wallet?
Terms apply. See CapitalOne.com for details.
On one occasion, there was a Black couple in the congregation who, they weren't there for long, I believe, but while they were in the congregation, they attended a church event, a church dance, and the wife didn't want to dance. So I think she was pregnant or something. And another woman went up to the husband and up to the wife and said, hey, can I dance with your husband? And the wife, of course, said, fine. She was cool with it. Well, this white woman and this Black man then were not dating, they were dancing. And the ministers literally stopped them on the floor and didn't permit them, to continue dancing. There was another incident, which, I remember very clearly. We were teenagers in our youth program, and once in a while we would have these, weekend getaways so that we could, get indoctrinated even more. And one evening we had a dance, and this pastor, the one that we talked about before, the one that was going to fix us, seemed to think that we were a bunch of classless folks. And so he always wanted, us to, learn ballroom dancing. So this evening we're learning some ballroom steps. And, I remember, pairing off with, various boys, you switched for every dance. But from the corner of my eye, I noticed that there was this boy, this, Black friend of mine who was off into the corner. And he was dancing by himself because there was no Black girl except for maybe his sister. And I don't remember if his sister was at this event or not. And if she was, she probably was dancing with her other brother. And he was dancing with a broom off to the side. And I just thought, I was so upset, about this. Yeah. I mean, I was a teenager, I was indoctrinated, but there was something about this that really hit me. And I remember just being upset about it and even talking, to my parents about it. I didn't have another worldview. Like I said, I was indoctrinated. So I was angry, but I didn't do anything about it. I don't know that I could have done anything about it.
If somebody was to approach this congregation and accuse them of segregation after desegregation, I'm sure they would have had lots of evidence to defend themselves. But contrary to that, segregation was clearly something that was still prevalent within church-related activities.
Yeah, I mean, the one scripture, and there probably were several, as children, we were basically forced to memorize tons of scripture and even, the order of the books of the Bible. So a lot of this has, since left me after, so many decades. But one of the scriptures that I remember that they used, and just kind of generally, was, don't be unequally yoked. And so they would apply that to not, socializing with people who were not in the cult, but also in this racist manner, that, you can't, people who are different can't come together. And certainly, because of this British Israelism and this, this purity, that Armstrong was trying to maintain, it only makes sense because of that particular theory, making sense that they included that, not that, I condone, this type of
yeah,
activity.
absolutely. Yeah. Oh no, that's absolutely clear. Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's so many things that are problematic with what we've discussed today. But my main kind of feel around all of this is that you can't just put people into one tidy little box. You can't dismiss mental health, ill mental health, and sexual orientation, and ethnicity, and race, and political affiliations, and all of these things. You can't. And again, it comes back to that thing we talked about at the start, which is individualism. You can't.
Right.
It doesn't. It can't. It's not humane. Right. It's not ethical. Right. It's not fair. It's not. And I know people say, "Well, life isn't fair," but this is done. It's not like life isn't fair. Like the big company that you work for has suddenly gone into liquidation, and you find yourself without a job, and you're right. Like, "Oh my goodness, life isn't fair." This particular environment has been manually constructed
right.
by men
right.
to actually create this environment of groupthink and to deter individualism, and that is why it's wrong, and that is why
right. And in environments like this, I mean, you can kind of see how, I gained or gleaned a lot from learning about various models that explain cults, and Dr. Hassan, certainly has one model. They're all helpful, but one of the things that I learned from Steve Hassan is this idea of your individuality, your authentic self, and how that authentic self is there, and it either is suppressed if you're a first generation cult member. It's there and it's suppressed, and hopefully you can get back to it at some point if you were to leave the cult. But for a second generation cult member, that authentic self doesn't develop until after one leaves. So there isn't anything, I can't, when I left the cult, there's not an authentic self that I can just quickly bounce back to. It didn't exist. Now, yes, I mean, it's there, but it wasn't developed, and I was not self-aware of what that was. And so it takes time, to understand what that is. And any cult is not going to allow that self-expression, your authentic self to come through. It's not about who you are as an individual.
Well,
You
it's
have
dangerous,
to fit
isn't it?
into that box. For them, you have to fit into that box.
The danger that comes with individualism is also what comes from forming your likes and dislikes and opinions on things, and then, you know, critical thinking, and from critical thinking comes further thoughts around right and wrong, and how do I feel about this, what do I think about this, not what is told to me, what is wrong, what is right, or how I should think and how I should feel. How do I feel? What do I think? Having that thought, and then instead of just squashing it down and throwing it away, just kind of allowing yourself to follow that thought and consider things and think, actually, I like shellfish, so I'm going to eat shellfish, even though I'm not allowed shellfish, but shellfish are really good. So it's kind of like allowing yourself to have those moments. And of course,
exactly,
the first step towards that is individualism.
Exactly, right.
So you've talked there briefly about the youth group that you were encouraged to be a part of, and instead, you know, Saturday evenings you would be at the youth group, and some of the retreats that you went on where you said that you were kind of, they were used to just further indoctrinate, and this youth group, was it the equivalent of kind of meeting up with friends outside of school? Was it used as an alternative for your leisure time and to kind of maybe prevent you from socializing with us worldly people?
Yeah. This youth group, they seem to put a lot of, you know, effort and money into it. And I think it was, you know, strategy to try to engage that second generation and, you know, in the hopes of keeping them long term. So this group, and it was called YOU, which stood for Youth Opportunities United. It was basically for teenagers, so ages 13 to 18 specifically. And so they provided sports for the kids, since most of us weren't part of extracurricular activities at school. We weren't really, you know, allowed to do that. Many of the games with YOU were on Saturday evenings and also on Sundays. So that basically was my weekend, you know, Saturday and Sunday, it, you know, almost from, you know, sun up to sundown, I was completely involved either in attending church services or being, you know, part of this group. During the week, you know, of course, it was, you know, it was a little quieter. This for teenagers really replaced all of the socializing and the activities that a normal teenager would have, you know, whether they had it in school or in the community. There were mandatory Bible studies that they would attend, you know, that we would attend after church. And like I mentioned, there were some fun activities, which, you know, frankly, I really quite enjoyed, because it was really my only outlet to do fun things and to socialize, which I really loved doing. You know, sports like cheerleading, basketball, volleyball, track. And we would have these meets just like school teams do. And we'd play other YOU teams from other nearby congregations. So, you know, it was definitely, you know, an outlet for us. Another activity that the cult provided through the YOU program was summer camp. Unfortunately, my parents and many others, you know, really couldn't afford to send their kids to summer camp every year, because, you know, 30% of their 20 to 30% at any given year was being, you know, taken out of their paycheck. But one year, with the financial help of the cult, I was able to attend a summer camp. I went to Big Sandy, Texas, the college campus there. So that was like a 3-week intense indoctrination that included Bible studies, but also included, you know, fun activities like long distance cycling and swimming and, meeting kids from around the country who, of course, were, in the cult.
You mentioned there with the financial help of the church, you were able to attend one year. And I wonder, what else was the church's money spent on? Because if 20 to 30% of each person involved in the church, and one congregation itself could have up to 400 congregants that you'd experience, so perhaps maybe even more in other places. Yeah. Where was all this money going? To the pension funds for that
certainly was part of it.
Right.
Yeah. And were certainly part of it. So just a quick breakdown of the tithes. There was this 10% tithe, right? That was like off the top. That really supported, the cult. And I'll get into in just a moment what exactly that supported. Then there was an additional 10% that cult members were to keep in their own savings and blow basically 1 week of the year during the Feast of Tabernacles. So they were to live the high life that week. Everything that they weren't able to afford, the rest of the year, because, they're socking away 30%. That 10%, which is a huge amount of money to have to spend, for 1 week, that was used for that. And then there was this final 10%. And that 10% was paid by members every third year. And that 10% was used to support widows, people who were orphaned, and even people who were like spiritually widowed or spiritually orphaned, as the cult would mention. For instance, those parents who one was in the church and one was not, they may not allow the cult member that they're married to tithe or to save money for the Feast of Tabernacles. And so that third tithe, it was called the tithe of the tithe. That was to go for things like that. Now, the 10% that was required right off the top, that went to headquarters, and that paid for all manner of luxury for the leader. It also paid for telecast. It paid for all the free pamphlets, the free magazines, the occasional book that Armstrong would write. It would pay for Armstrong's luxurious lifestyle, which of course is, his personal items were never in his name. They were in the cult's name. It paid for the mansion he lived in, the Rolls Royces he was driven in, and all of the church's properties. Finally, those tithes also paid for very extravagant, expensive gifts that Armstrong would give to world leaders to gain an audience with world presidents, kings, queens, dictators. So he videotaped himself giving these expensive gifts to leaders. Of course, it was all propaganda. Armstrong told the membership that God was calling him to speak about the coming kingdom of God to the world leaders, and that this is what it would take, these expensive, extravagant gifts to get the world leaders to hear the word of God. And how this was so necessary during these, end times, that the world leaders definitely needed to hear God's word, during the end times. And the very fact that it occurred, he used that as some sort of proof that it is the end times, because God said that in the end times, all of the nations would be preached to. So, very, very circular. Of course, none of these leaders even knew who Armstrong was. His gifts, of course, were paid by hardworking, members who often struggled just to feed their own family.
And feels almost like it's just for Armstrong to have accolades in his back pocket, much like we see with Scientology with Tom Cruise and John Travolta and other famous people who are devoted to the church and list their religion as Scientology. Again, Charles Manson did the same thing.
Right.
Told that he wrote on his prison document that his religion was Scientology. So, how many accolades do you really want? And which ones are you going to brag about? Which ones are you going to try and kind of deny? But it's often that groups will seek people that have influence in the public eye because it makes them seem more credible. It makes them seem more powerful. It makes them seem like they must really know what they're talking about, because why would the Queen of England meet with me if I didn't really know what I was if I didn't really know what I was saying? But also, he is putting himself in the world and he's justifying it using scripture. So he's going against everything that church congregants are taught, even though they are paying for him to go on these trips. He is not being of the world. He is being in the world. He is going and he is having an audience with these people that are in these positions of influence and people that are in these positions of power and people that will make him seem more credible in his message. But then he's also saying that it's like he's self-fulfilling his own prophecy, because he's saying the nations will hear when the end of the world is near. So he's creating a situation.
He's creating his own prophecy.
So it's not happening organically, is it? It's
No.
manufactured again. It's manufactured by man, by Armstrong, and the fact that he taped himself and broadcasted it to followers, does that speak to his own narcissism and sense of self-importance? Or does that speak to him trying to make sure that it is recorded proof that he has spoken to the nations and the nations have heard? It's like when we were talking about the people that snitch. Is it because they genuinely want to be as pure as possible, or are they doing it because they are vindictive and smug and whichever way you want to describe a person that might do something like that? But again, it's difficult.
I think Armstrong did it for two reasons. One, definitely, ego, but also, you've got this propaganda, this proof, this recorded videotape proof that he's there with the Queen of England, that he's, there with, I think Egypt has like a president. So he was there, and they met with him. And so this is proof that if he is meeting with the great leaders of the world, he must be important. He must be sent by God. And we must keep supporting this good work.
It's seen so often in these other groups where, in the NXIVM documentaries, they highlight that so perfectly, where celebrities endorse the message of the leader, and therefore how can there be anything nefarious? How can there be anything wrong?
And I bet these leaders did not even know that they were being indirectly used to endorse this cult. I strongly believe that they had no idea. Often there are cameras, when they meet with anyone, right? So this is just another camera.
One of the things you mentioned in your writing to me before we kind of move on to what your journey out of the group looked like, was you mentioned something called a place of safety, and I wondered if you could just talk the listeners through what that means.
Okay, I'll try to describe that. The place of safety was a location. At the time, it was yet to be confirmed, but it was a place that God was going to lead us to through his end time apostle, Herbert W. Armstrong, of course, at the beginning of the Great Tribulation that would last 3.5 years. So, a lot of these terms like tribulation or 3.5 years, this is taken from Revelations and some other scriptures. So at this point, at the beginning of the Great Tribulation, there would be this Antichrist that would come. And that was supposed to be a Catholic Pope. And he would literally be the son of Satan. And he would require all of us to deny Christ and join a one world religion that all of the inhabitants of the earth would be forced to adopt. And most of them will, allegedly, right? That one world Catholic or Catholic-like religion would require everyone to bow down to the Antichrist and also deny Christ as Savior and God. Whoever doesn't bow down to the Antichrist, even if they weren't God's special, chosen ones, would be tortured and killed, and there would be gnashing of teeth and such. So this is called the Great Tribulation, and that was supposed to last 3.5 years. But God is going to protect his people, and he's going to send the members of this particular cult, obviously the one and only true church, to this place of safety where, things might be rough, like, when the Israelites were wandering around the desert, they certainly didn't have everything they wanted, but they had everything they needed. So we would be safe under God's protection for the entirety of the 3.5 years until Christ returned for the second time to fight the armies of the world at Armageddon. So this place of safety, while Armstrong wasn't really sure exactly where that would be yet, so it wasn't like confirmed because he was waiting for God to tell him at the right time, he speculated that would be in Petra, which is, located in Jordan, if you're not familiar with where Petra is. But, and I just remember trying to figure out, as a kid who completely bought into this, but also trying to, work this out in my mind, how exactly we were going to get to Petra if we wouldn't leave to go there until the beginning of the tribulation. Like, aren't they going to lock down the airports? Won't the authorities realize that we're flying across the world with no luggage, trying to escape this, one world religion with this Catholic Pope Antichrist? What are we going to eat there? Like, it was a desert. There was supposed to be like a total of 144,000 people, the 144,000 saints. And we were all physically going to be saved from this end time tribulation. So I wonder, does Petra even have running water? I don't know. Do I bring my razor? I don't know.
What if 145,000 of us turn up? What happens then? Do we all have to kind of pick a number and hope?
Yeah. Do I get to pick my desired little cubby hole that's carved out in the rocks in Petra? I don't know. Do I just, if I'm not allowed to go with luggage, I remember literally asking my parents, do I just put on 2 or 3 jeans on top of each other so that at least I have a change of clothing when we get there? Do I just put on as many socks as I can if I'm supposed to go without luggage?
I think it's normal for a kid to take it literally and ask those questions. And I genuinely wonder what your parents thought at that point. I wonder if they were well, it's obviously we're not going to have to get to Jordan. That's not really what's going to happen. It's metaphorical or something like that. Or I wonder if they left.
No, they literally thought. They literally
that's a very good question. I wonder what we are. What should we do? Maybe 3 pairs of jeans is a really good idea.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting. They certainly, this being a Bible cult, and fundamentalist in nature, certainly took, I would say, maybe not all of the Bible scriptures, but certainly the majority of them, very literally. And so this is a literal place of safety. This is a literal, escaping the Antichrist. And I remember them just not really being able to answer me at all. There was a lot of speculation. Well, maybe this will happen, or maybe that'll happen, but we don't really know because we're not at that period of time yet. I don't think, I remember, being told by my parents that, when the time comes, you're not going to be worried about having a change of genes. That's the least thing that you're going to be concerned with. We're going to be basically escaping with our lives, and that will have to be good enough.
This notion of the Pope being the most evil person, the Antichrist, was this an idea that was unique to the Worldwide Church of God? Was it something that Armstrong had come up with himself? I wonder if that speaks to his ego, because the Pope is supposed to be God's messenger on earth. The Pope is supposed to be, the figurehead at the top of the, of the Christian church. He's supposed to be the person that, the purest, best of all of us, most, saintly, all of those things, the closest thing to God that we will get on this plane. So if Armstrong is then saying that this person is actually the devil in disguise, the Antichrist, is that speaking to Armstrong's own ego? Like, there cannot be another person on this planet that is more closer to God than I am. I don't know.
Yeah, I think the answer is probably convoluted and long, but in short, I don't think that Armstrong was the only one who believed this. He got his ideas from other groups. Some of his doctrines were, word for word, and others he tweaked along the way. What I do understand from, just the little education I have about the history of Christianity is that, Protestantism is views Catholicism as not being Christian. And so I think that is probably, the foundation of it, and it stems from there. But again, after hundreds of years, one group stemming from another and another and another, somewhere along the way, someone prior to, Armstrong had this idea that the Antichrist is really, the Catholic Pope, and or a future Catholic Pope, maybe not the current one, but Catholicism as a whole, because it's so full of paganism and idolatry with their crosses and their statues and such, has been really painted by many Christians over history as being not of God. And somehow he ended up being the Antichrist of the future.
I think that just speaks so loudly to the Catholic Church, or the Roman Catholic Church. It is the largest sect of Christianity, by far, I think. So these people that lead these lesser known sects, like in school, people that could almost say, oh, you're Jehovah's Witness. I kind of get that. I know that there's some things you don't celebrate, but you never would have been able to say, oh, I'm with the Worldwide Church of God. And the kids go, oh, do you know what? That's okay. I know why you're not. But Catholicism, it's so huge, and it dominates almost to the point where often people will think that Christianity and Catholicism are two different things, because they're both so huge that they don't realize that Catholicism is just the biggest sect of Christianity. It uses Christian doctrine in its own right, in the same way that Seventh-day Adventists and the Worldwide Church of God used Christian doctrine.
I'll say that, and maybe I think partially it could be a culture thing. I once took a grad course on the history of Christianity and politics, specifically in the United States. And the culture in the United States is a little, a little bit unique in comparison to, in Europe, for instance. And I won't get into, all the learning that I had in this particular course, but one of the things, to this day in the southern part of the United States is that they very clearly do not accept Catholicism as being Christian. And it's not quite the same up here, in the North. But, just even the history of religion and politics here in the United States is fascinating. We only just had our second Catholic president. All of our other presidents, except for two of them, were Protestant. And that's not just, by coincidence. As a country, we seem to steer away from leaders of our country anyway, who were Catholic. There's definitely a Catholic prejudice, if you will, to just kind of, summarize it and simplify it. There's a type of prejudice and discrimination against Catholics by more of the evangelical Christians in this country.
And perhaps that aligns with the view of the Pope being the Antichrist in the way that a lot of these movements that we saw in the Second Great Awakening and, Millerism and the Millerites and then all that followed, which we've, gone into in this episode, perhaps that is a show of all of that evangelism in the face of Catholicism, because it's kind of simultaneously rejecting the Catholic teachings. And every time a group branches off from, William Miller and everything that proceeds underneath that, it's kind of,
it gets more fanatical. It gets more extreme.
It does. And so the idea that the Pope is the Antichrist, it encapsulates that rejection of the Catholic Church and the Catholic teachings, and as well as simultaneously reinforcing the teachings of the worldwide Church of God. So it's interesting that place of safety, but I think completely rational for a child to ask those types of questions. What will I need to take with me? This day be saying, where will I charge my phone?
How do I pack? How do I pack for this?
So you mentioned something briefly before that was interesting about a memoir. So you said, I'm going to include that in my memoir. And I don't know if I had an inkling about you doing any writing, but of course that can only take place because you have left the church. So can you tell us how, when, and why you eventually left the Worldwide Church of God?
Yeah. So I was about, 20 years old when I left. It was actually shortly after my friend died, by suicide. As I've alluded to before, as a teenager, I kind of questioned some of the cult's biblical interpretation, its general worldview, especially including, the ideas around British Israelism, as well as, particular eschatology of the cult. So, their end of world beliefs and such. But, so when I was 20, my friend who died of suicide, he was gay. I later found out. I think I mentioned that before. I didn't realize it for many years, but, this loss marked a change in me and, has really influenced my life and started me on the path to discovering just how cults negatively impact our lives and really the lives of those around us, our friends, the devastating impact it has on our relationships with our non-cult family and also our family that, was in the cult with us, and just society at large. So when I left, I told some of my friends in the cult that I was leaving, although they didn't have their own distinct ways of following the cult's rules. Not all of them were following everything, the way that the cult would want them to do. When I left, every single one of them abandoned me. Admittedly, I didn't stay in contact with the friends that left before me. You got to remember, this is like the 90s, and we didn't have Facebook. We didn't have internet at the time. It just took a lot more, to stay connected. So I even remember one of my friends, a single 20-something first generation cult member, in a nearby congregation. He was actually a recreational drug user, I found out, and using drugs that I would consider, hard drugs, not just weed. And he even offered me drugs once but I declined. Even he stopped talking to me immediately after I left the cult, which wow. I thought was so interesting. It's like, you're doing drugs, dude, and you won't talk to me because I am questioning doctrines of a church. It just, kind of blew my mind. But, so at the time I didn't really have anyone to talk to about this experience when I left, just except for my parents, who seemed to be a little understanding. But I think they were understanding because they too were having questions about the cult. Sadly, though, this was my only religious or spiritual influence at the time, my parents, and they were kind of steering me more towards, fringe religious groups. Some of these groups, these are ones that adhere to Christian identity movement, which we briefly discussed earlier as being what British Israelism kind of evolved into. I ended up visiting a couple of these groups, but basically just realized almost immediately that this wasn't the direction I wanted to go. It didn't seem healthy. It didn't seem normal or balanced. And not that I really knew what those things were at the time, but it was definitely, trying to figure that out. And these groups just seemed to be more fringe than the direction that I really wanted to go. I really wanted to integrate into society and just try to come to something that seemed more reasonable. So when I left, I literally thought that God was going to strike me dead somehow, because I left his one true church and his protection was no longer with me. Also, I was taught in the cult that to know the truth and then reject it was worse than, being one of the people in the world who never even knew it to begin with. So not only did I think that I was going to lose God's protection, but that he was, actually going to come after me. But, I pushed through that feeling and I left anyway.
And after that difficult and lonely experience, what has life been like since? How did you arrive kind of where you are today? You said that you were able to go on to have a fabulous education. And you mentioned you've got a very good group of friends. And again, going back to that comment you made about writing a memoir.
I would say that my life now is almost the complete antithesis of basically what was expected of me in the cult. There were things that I started doing immediately upon leaving and other things that, kind of took me some time to kind of get around to. But some of those things were, immediately registering to vote, showing up for jury duty. I'm all up to date on my vaccinations. I rely on conventional medicine exclusively for my medical needs. I don't even like herbs. I'm a feminist. I'm politically and socially progressive and, have convictions really that are diametrically opposed to the cult's teachings. And, for that matter, convictions that are diametrically opposed to many fundamentalist and evangelical Christian churches as well, not just this particular cult. I've been married, divorced, remarried. This is something that would not have been easily done, in the cult. Big advocate for education, insatiable desire to learn and really take that opportunity as often as I can. But I also, engage myself in informal education, such as reading nonfiction or traveling, which I think is just really a great way to learn about the world and, the cultures in the world and, just everyone that lives in, our very small world, really. I've been going to college on and off for the past 25 years. I've completed 2 college degrees. I'm currently on my 3rd. I also did some postgraduate studies, as I've mentioned here and there, in the history of Christianity, religion, philosophy, psychology of cults. And then currently I'm pursuing a graduate degree in counseling, and I plan on specializing in part in counseling cult survivors. I have, on and off been penning a memoir. So I do hope to finish that, someday soon. A lot of these things are, positive and productive, and, I'm certainly proud of, the way that I've integrated into society, but, there are some other things, not everything is, sunshine and rainbows. I see a therapist because things come up now and then. In recent years anyway, I learned that I suffered from complex PTSD as a result of being in this cult. So, I'm working through that. Sadly, I'm virtually estranged from my parents, which, is how they would prefer our relationship. Like so many cult survivors, they were never deprogrammed. They didn't engage in self-awareness about, what led them into the cult. They didn't seek psychological counseling. And their path has led them very far away from me. They basically cult hopped and, took a path that led them to, increasingly extreme churches and ideologies, like we were talking about before, that it seems like a lot of offshoots just seem to get more radical. My belief is that, my family survived the Worldwide Church of God cult, but, eventually I lost my parents to other cults and ideologies that came after that. So, for them and for some others that I know, the Worldwide Church of God, basically only served as a gateway to either equally destructive or even more destructive cults.
I think we can see that in the way that you mentioned that the Worldwide Church of God disbanded and all of the congregants who were left without a place to go chose one of the random branches, or maybe the closest one, or the one that was most similar to the Worldwide Church of God, or maybe the one that their neighbors were going to join, or however they chose a specific tangent of the Worldwide Church of God, one of these more radical branches that existed off of the back of the Worldwide Church of God, which existed off of the back of Seventh-day Adventists, which exists off of the back of William Miller and so on and so forth.
And there's some other groups even that, currently, we talked about Christian identity, and there are some groups that, currently have as their foundational teaching Christian identity. And I know some people that moved over there. And as far as I understand, these more white supremacist Christian identity, small religious groups that are, more extreme in their dress, more extreme in their practices.
We've seen, we mentioned it's problematic when history has the opportunity to repeat itself in certain ways. Using doctrine to justify racial purity, not ideal in any aspect. And if people can explain away those things using scripture, I don't see how it isn't intrinsically linked to things like the Holocaust.
Right. I mean, it's, and when we even take a look at the, what we're seeing in this country, which actually is affecting other countries as well, including yours, QAnon, and how some of the beliefs that the QAnon is spouting off are things that I heard in conspiracy circles many, many years ago. I never, decades ago, thought that these fringe conspiracy beliefs would become mainstream. And yet some of them, certainly seem like they're connected to, Christian identity and some other just really destructive and harmful belief systems.
Mm-hmm. Are people so disenchanted with everything that they are looking to conspiracies and online communities and looking for ways to make more meaning in their lives by accusing companies like Wayfair of child trafficking, which links back to QAnon, which leads back to our Lord and Savior Donald Trump. And there is this blend, as you mentioned, between the evangelical movement and QAnon, and they're kind of like merging, and it's hard to draw lines between the two because the beliefs are so radical, and the rhetoric sounds so similar between the two groups that you're actually starting to identify that a lot of the QAnon members are practicing evangelists. And then from there you go on to talk about, you mentioned Dungeons and Dragons before, and how Dungeons and Dragons is seen as a way to invite in Satan, and Dungeons and Dragons was one of the big things that was put out by evangelists in the 70s around the Satanic Panic movement, and they were using it as if your kid plays Dungeons and Dragons, they are worshipping the devil, they are practicing in satanic rituals. And of course what came from that was televangelists and the evangelical movement looking for satanic signs in Procter and Gamble things and McDonald's, and all of a sudden there's this, there's preschools being shut down and people being put on trial for murdering babies and all sorts of other horrible things that children testified to and turns out never happened. Are we on the cusp of that again? There was the whole Pizzagate thing that happened, where the person stormed the pizza restaurant looking for the basement where children were being sacrificed and eaten, and then it turned out that the pizza restaurant didn't even have a basement. Mm-hmm. And they came to that conclusion because they thought they'd recognized some code in some communication between Hillary Clinton and the pizza restaurant. I mean, some of these ideas, being on the outside of these, conspiracy circles, some of these ideas, stand alone, and they just seem so crazy. How could anyone believe that there are lizard people and the Queen of England is one of them? I mean, I know there are, lots of people that don't necessarily like her or like Hillary Clinton, mm-hmm. but lizard people, that's a little far-fetched. And you got the people who even, believe in a flat earth. I mean, didn't we prove that a long time ago? Like, how can we are regressing? Our civilization is regressing. And I really fear for, where we are as a society and, the information, quote unquote, information that's not necessarily all accurate. I really fear for what people are willing to believe. And, I think you can look at the QAnon movement and the current evangelical situation in America, and you can kind of connect it to some of these interviews that we've had on the show, where it's, you know, you don't jump in at lizard people and flat earth. It's a very slow introduction of more softer, less radical ideas, less out there conspiracies, where, you know, or even starting with things like MK Ultra or Big Pharma, you know, conspiracies that have been proven, and then go on to things that you can say, you know, well, oh, why didn't it happen? Because of X, Y, Z. You know, 9/11, for example, a set of very, I mean, it's hard to say, but and this is the same with all conspiracies. A set of coincidental events that make it seem like there is another extremely plausible answer as to why those things happened. And then once you have that and you go further, you know, if you're watching YouTube videos, the algorithm is so aggressive, it takes you further and further and further and further and further and further. And, you know, if you're on sites like 4chan or Reddit or forums or, you know, even Facebook now, because the alt-right, for some reason, you know, are made up of people's mums and dads and cousins all of a sudden who are reposting all of this stuff, say, didn't you know that the Queen is a lizard? And genuinely kind of believing it.
Yeah. I mean, I remember in the year 2016, you know, I'm just happily on YouTube, not doing anything that's, you know, particularly considered, you know, fringe. And I remember a video coming up, you know, on YouTube, a suggested video about how the mass murder of children in that Connecticut school, because Sandy Hook, wasn't real, and it was full of actors. And I thought, what? And I did not know that there was this amount of misinformation out there. I didn't know who Alex Jones was. And I texted my husband and I said, did you know and I watched it. That was, you know, problem number one. That, you know, even someone like me, they got to, you know, they were able to get to hit play. And I'm always on watch for cultic like things. And so I hit watch and I watched the entire video. And when my husband got home from work, I said, you know, you got to see this documentary I saw. How is this even possible? The whole thing was fake. And he looks at me, he goes, no, do not give that any mind. Do you know who Alex Jones is? No. This definitely happened. Let me show you who Alex Jones is. Yeah. And as soon as I learned about it, I was like, oh.
Luckily you had somebody there who could direct you to look at the situation from one end to the other, as opposed to coming across this Sandy Hook video and watching it from that, and then, you know, watching more of those videos. Who knows
what comes after that?
And then being told about Alex Jones and being like, well, he speaks nothing but the truth. So luckily you had somebody who could point you the other direction to go the other way around.
and you know, the thing is that the Sandy Hook video, or at least the title of it, you know, certainly got me to watch it.
Clickbait, absolutely.
And it wouldn't have gotten everyone to watch it, but everyone, in my opinion, from what I understand, has, you know, clicked on something, believed something, read something that wasn't exactly true. And it's so easy to do that. You don't have to, you know, you don't have to be someone who is uneducated or weak, you know, of mind to get sucked into clicking on that, you know, that one thing that doesn't seem so radical. And then you're drawn to, you know, more and more radical.
And that's the difficult thing with the QAnon and evangelical movements at the moment. They are kind of seem to be blending into one thing, but also it doesn't just start off with people lying in the streets of Dallas, Texas, because JFK is going to make a sudden appearance, even though he's been dead for years. You know, it doesn't start. It doesn't start there. It starts it starts off with a video about ancient aliens and why they are visiting Earth or why they've always been here. And then all of a sudden, it progresses. So, and same, if I walked into a church hall today and they said, you can't dance with this black woman, you can't dance with this black man, you can't dance with anybody who isn't white, I'd be like, okay, well then I'm not going to stay here. Absolutely not.
But it doesn't start there. They don't talk about that in the, telebroadcast. They talk about very general topics, like the state of the world and, the rise in crime and the rise in wars around the world. And,
very factual things that you could say, yeah, I agree with that because I know that it's true.
Right. And then wouldn't you want a better way? Don't you want a better way? Don't you wish there was a better way that we could all follow and live in peace and harmony and happiness? And you're like, yeah, send me that free booklet. If I don't have to pay and I'm going to get more information, great. And that's how Armstrong worked. He knew, in years past, I, even took marketing courses. He knew the power of, that free item to hook you.
So just as we finish up today, my last question to you is to ask you what advice you would give to others who are perhaps second, third generation members of a high demand religious group and are looking to move away or have moved away and are struggling to navigate integration into typical everyday life for people who are already here?
Yeah, it's a very good question because, even though I left, the cult so many years ago, decades now, there are things once in a while that still come up. And I think, wow, I need a little help navigating this, whether it's, Christmas carols or, what have you. But, I think that I would say that, if you're in a cult and thinking of leaving or recently out of a cult and you think things are difficult, I just want people to know that life actually does get better. Everybody doesn't lose their parents or their loved ones. If anything, life is more rewarding. Our sphere gets larger, more diverse. Life is different, especially as a second generation. There are certain things that, I'm programmed, I guess is the best word to use, that, come up for me, once in a great while, but, life is different, but it will be better because leaving and being on the outside of a cult allows us to rediscover or even develop, our authentic selves. And, we get to choose our own path. One of the things I think is kind of tough is just be kind to yourself, where we are our own worst critics. We need to be patient in our growth. And, as we grow, as long as we stay clear of, cults and work on our self-awareness, that growth will continue. Get educated. And that's not necessarily, about going to a university and getting a formal education. But, one of the most important things I think to learn is these, critical thinking skills. Sure, many learn that in university and, but those skills are not exclusive to formal education. And I think that we can, learn those outside of a university as well. I feel like it's one of the most important learnings that anyone, cult survivor or not, should really have. One thing I would say that I regret is just not seeking professional help immediately to adjust to the real world, and kind of integrate into Western American culture. Although I left physically, it does take time to unravel all of that binding, all of that, the brainwashing of the cult. At the time, especially with the indoctrination that I had regarding, mental health and psychologists, I physically left, but I still wasn't completely buying into psychology. I was taught to be skeptical of them. So I didn't think that going to therapy was really going to be a positive experience, or that it would be able to help me at all. I did pretty well on my own, considering, but in retrospect, I just think that I would have adjusted to the outside world a lot quicker, and perhaps with a little bit more grace than I did had I gone to a therapist. I also think that, it would have helped with processing all of the trauma as a result of that cult. As I mentioned before, I go to therapy now. I'm, currently working towards becoming a therapist myself. I'm genuinely interested in processing what comes up for me and understanding the roots of it. And if I can't fix it, to at least move through it in such a way that, it just really minimizes the negative impact that it has on my life. One thing I can say is just don't really underestimate the growth that can occur with a good therapist by your side, no matter how many years it's been since you've been out of a cult.
I feel like with these stories, something we learn is that recovery never really stops. Your remembering of certain pieces of scripture and doctrine that were kind of fed to you throughout your entire childhood may flash.
They do.
May flash to you occasionally, but the amount of times that happens will be fewer and far between as you kind of work through your recovery. But that doesn't mean that the recovery ever really ends. You're always kind of working on it. As you said there, you're so interested in continuing to learn, to understand, to work through those things when they come up, and really get to the root of why they're there, why it happens. And I think that is encouraging to people that will be listening. You said to be kind to yourself. I think that's so extremely important. A lot of people lay blame and guilt on themselves. I think the kindness is so important to remember, and to be patient with yourself as well, and to research and work on those critical thinking skills. Again, if you have those thoughts, go with them, see where they take you, let those seeds of doubt kind of sprout and flourish, and see what happens when they come to mind. Seek professional help if it's possible, if it's something that's within your financial capabilities or in the areas that you live in. It's not an option for everybody. But I think perhaps from what we've talked about today, the biggest message to take away from our conversation is to nurture your individualism. Yes. And however that comes out,
absolutely,
let it happen, and see where it takes you, especially the second and third generation members. And maybe fourth and fifth. We have had some kind of like even sixth generation members come on the show.
Wow.
Allow that individualism to happen. See where it takes you. Everyone talks about Harry Potter. Maybe you don't like Harry Potter. That's fine. Maybe you want to pick up a guitar, 55 years old. Play guitar. See what happens. Maybe you've got a knack for it. Maybe you're adept at playing the guitar.
Right. And in many ways throughout, the decades that I've been out, I did some of these things. It wasn't just about, rebelling against the cult's doctrines and rules. Yes, I certainly did do that as well. But, something that you said kind of reminded me of some things, because my family didn't make a lot of money, and then they had to give 20 to 30% of it away. There wasn't really money there to do some of these, these other activities that would kind of have me grow into my own, like music lessons. So as an adult, I took some music lessons, and then I realized that was not for me. Maybe it would have been if I did it younger, maybe it would have never stuck, as a young child anyway. But just allowing yourself to do these things, even, things that most people do as children, I was exploring, as an adult.
Try things, you might not like them. Try other things, you might love them. I think that too is encouraging. And be a lifelong learner, that's fine. Just because we didn't learn things in childhood that other people may have experienced, it doesn't mean that it is too late to pick up that guitar or go to those music lessons or sit down and see if you want to draw. And I know that I'm talking about artistic things, but that's because people that tune in each week will know that I'm a huge advocate for kind of having some kind of artistic expression. But maybe it's going and researching and reading nonfiction and reading research papers, or maybe it's watching documentaries. And again, like art, it's still art forms, but yeah.
No, you're absolutely correct. I know that I don't have any talent in art, but one of the things that I appreciated even as a child, and got to explore more in my adult years, was appreciating art. Museums, art galleries, this was something that was not particularly encouraged or emphasized by the cult. So, just really embracing, just all the creativity that's out there in all of its forms. Music, dance, onstage performances, paintings. These are all things that, while I have zero talent in, and I've tried, I can most definitely appreciate. And so it's something that I, include in my lifestyle, something that I was not able to have and include as a child, as a teenager in the cult.
So we've covered the history of the Worldwide Church of God. We've talked about a lot of personal political opinions and thoughts
I think at one point there we got really, really personal. Yeah.
But we've also managed to, I think the reason we've talked so much about our beliefs and opinions on things like politics and the history of the church, and perhaps people's intentions with the certain branches and sects of Christianity, is because we have tried to stay away from too much personal information on you as an individual. So some of the listeners are probably like, why have they gone so off track today? But I think that's where that's come from. We're focused more on the overview of the church because we haven't looked at you as an individual. We've looked at the situation as a whole with some little peppered bits of personal information. So we've covered.
Hopefully it's enough to give your listeners an idea of what it was like to grow up in that cult, but also, what it felt like, here and there as we have gone through our discussion. I, try to include certain things like, what was it like in school, for instance?
Absolutely. And I think all of that has translated across. I know that the Philadelphia Church of God episode that we did has generated the most communication to me, where people have asked to be put in touch with Hannah, who came and spoke on the show. So
that's great. I remember listening to her, to that podcast, and that is what prompted me to contact you, because, I heard her story and I thought, somebody needs they need to hear where this church came from. They need to hear the mother church, so to speak. Of course, there's no end to it, but being an offshoot of Worldwide Church of God, I thought, somebody needs to hear what it was like in that cult.
that's the beauty of these episodes as well. These experiences, they bring forward other people who want to highlight their experiences, and the catalogue just grows, and there is such a wealth of testimonials now on the podcast that people who have had any type of cult-like experience can find something that they identify with in at least one of these episodes. And it's accessible for people who have maybe experienced a loved one who has gone and joined a high demand religious group or a high controlling group, and they can say, where do I even begin? You know, that they will be able to find something in at least one of these episodes that helps them. So it's, you know, it's an educational tool as well as something that is interesting to listen to, you know, from somebody on the outside who's never had these experiences. To me, I just kind of sit here and think, wow, what a lot to ponder on. So thank you so much for your time today, Minerva. I appreciate you coming here and giving me so much of your time. We've spoken for so long. Again, we've only really touched the surface, which seems to be the motto of this show. But I really do think it's going to be a great tool for people that come in and listen. So thank you so much for agreeing to come and share your experiences with me, and for being open and you know, still agreeing to come forward, even though there are parts of yourself that you have decided to keep anonymous, which obviously we completely respect.
Thank you so much. I really do appreciate, you know, you allowing me to, you know, tell my story. And who knows, you know, maybe one day I'll come back and give you the rest of it.
I would absolutely love that. Thank you so much, Minerva. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
Take care. Bye. That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, and this has been the Cult Vault.
Everyone loves shopping online. Well, I'm going to tell you what I tell my golf buddies when they buy clubs. Stop searching for coupon codes. Download Capital One Shopping to your computer. Capital One Shopping instantly searches for available coupon codes and automatically applies them at checkout. Plus, it's free, and you don't even need a Capital One card to use it. That's like hitting a hole-in-one without even trying. Capital One Shopping. It's kind of genius. What's in your wallet?
Savings and available coupons vary.